Hello and welcome to my look back for 2023. Today I want to go over every game I finished last year. And just to be clear, it doesn't matter if they have been released this year or I finally left my backlog. So, and just to get it out of the way, let's start with the only non-Sony console I played this year, the Nintendo Switch. The one and only game I played on the Nintendo handheld this year is Pokémon Scarlet. The 9th generation of Pokémon is probably the most disappointing for me, and I really hope that it changes again with the next generation. Because as someone like me who started gaming with the 4th generation of Pokémon on the Nintendo DS back in the 2000s, it used to be a no-brainer to inhale every bit of Pokémon media right at release. But after the disappointing remakes of Diamond and Pearl, which I haven't finished to this day by the way, the game that was presented to us with the 9th generation lost me for almost a year before I got back to it every now and then for a few hours. And besides its flaws, I had a good time with it and finally finished it. But if I'm being honest, if it wasn't for my nostalgia-infected brain, this game wouldn't even have been close to getting a second chance, let alone being finished. The next console that I somewhat ignored this year was the PlayStation 3. But in this case it was thanks to my DualShock reaching the afterlife and my PS4 controller not being recognized by a lot of games I wanted to play. But nonetheless, I still managed to finish 2 games in their entirety this year. The first one being Asura's Wrath. Asura's Wrath is a game that feels like coming home from school as a kid and watching your favorite anime. The game is literally just action, action and more action, with a lot of interactive cutscenes, but even though it has not the deepest of stories, Asura's journey to revenge his wife and rescue his daughter in combination with the gameplay was engaging enough to keep me entertained for the entire length of this action adventure. The other PlayStation 3 title that left my pile of shame in 2023 is Call of Juarez: Bound in Blood, a first-person shooter in a Wild Western setting. It tells the story of 2 brothers who have to shoot their way through life after being on the run because they deserted to help their families. Again, the story is not that interesting, but the gunplay and sound design felt really good, especially for a game from 2009. So even though it's not a masterpiece, it kept me well entertained for the 6 hours it took me to finish. Coming to the PS4 and the first game I finished this year. The Somnium Files, an incredible detective murder mystery adventure with an immersive story and a great cast of characters, rounded by some dull humor that I had so much fun with that the next game I finished on the PS4 was The Somnium Files: Nirvana Initiative, which plays a few years after the events of the first game and improves on some of the weaknesses of the first game, but all in all was just not as good as the first iteration. After that follows a complete switch of genre with a remake of the first Mafia game, which is simply a lot of great cineastic action in an open world set in the 1930s and 40s. That doesn't overstay its welcome, with an engaging story that takes around 12 hours to finish. All in all, I had a great time with the shootouts as well as just driving around the surprisingly beautiful open world with some jazz coming out of the radio. Another game that was even shorter is Minecraft Dungeons, a Minecraft-themed Diablo-like action RPG. In the around 5-hour campaign you go through a few dungeons, fighting familiar foes like zombies, spiders and skeletons, loot and upgrade gear and beat some boss fights. And while I had a decent time with it, I don't remember anything outstanding about it, and I think that says enough considering I finished it only a few months ago. When you consume any type of media, sooner or later you will stumble across something that you would consider a 10 out of 10. And among those 10 out of 10s, there will be a few pieces of media that you treasure even more than the rest. And in terms of gaming, one of those for me is Persona 4 Golden. Set in a Japanese small town, you take the role of a transfer student at Yasogami High School. The main plot of the game revolves around serial killings and the Midnight Channel, which is a sort of parallel world where you fight so-called shadows in dungeon crawler style. What I love about this game is not only the turn-based combat system, the amazing soundtrack or how the plot is presented. The game has a type of vibe that I don't know how to put into words, but it makes this game incredibly immersive for me. And in addition to all of that, you have an amazing cast of characters that seem like a cliché at first, but have so many layers to their personalities. So for me this game is simply a masterpiece, and I'm glad that I got the opportunity to play it in its remastered form after all these years. And if the Persona 3 remake or Metaphor ReFantazio are able to give me more of the same feeling I had while playing Persona 4, my game of the year in 2024 is probably coming from Atlas. Next up on the list is a much smaller title with Dusk Diver, an action-adventure with hack-and-slash combat set in Taiwan. You play as a young woman who stumbles across the entry to a mirror version of her hometown that is infested with monsters. After getting the power of a so-called guardian spirit, she is assigned the mission to help to protect the real world from these creatures from the parallel world. The gameplay itself is not too deep and a bit clunky sometimes, but because of the general art style of the game, the combat looks flashy and stylish. But if I'm being honest, the around 10 hours have been more than enough for this game, and a longer version wouldn't be on this list. After discovering the Persona franchise a few years ago, and especially after finishing 4 this year, I was searching the internet for games that are supposed to have a similar feel to it. And one of those games was Sakura Wars, and sadly this was nothing like I was hoping. In Sakura Wars you have two types of gameplay. You either fight enemies in mecha hack and slash combat sections that are really fast paced and fun, but you also have very story heavy sections with an uncomfortable dating sim part that really dragged the game down for me. Nonetheless, I've had my fair share of fun with this game, and the story is actually quite engaging, especially with the tournaments where you fight in a competition against other teams of mech pilots from around the world. With the first Mass Effect, another classic finally leaves my pile of shame. And what can I say except now I finally get why this game has so many fans out there. You have a semi-open world with so much lore and stuff to discover that the first hours completely overwhelmed me. And the gunplay is so much better than modern games that combine shooter with RPG elements, where it sometimes feels like you're shooting BB guns. And in addition to that, you have a fantastic plot resolving around an Agent 4 threatening the entire universe. But my experience got overshadowed by a game-breaking bug really close to the end that destroyed my entire save game. But nevertheless, I think Mass Effect deserves the good reputation it has till this day. Another much shorter game that I already talked about on this channel is Guns, Gore and Cannoli 2, a 2D shooter slash platforming game set in the 1940s. The game is fast paced and doesn't take itself too serious. The story is not that deep, but the gameplay has some creative ideas, especially in the boss fights, and I think the game is best experienced in co-op mode. The final game for the PlayStation 4 of this year is another one of the titles I found when looking for Persona-like games. Blue Reflection is a turn-based RPG set in an all-girls high school in Japan, where you take the role of a girl that gains the ability to transform into a so-called reflector, that has to defend the world from giant creatures from another dimension. While the characters and sceneries look stunning, the general gameplay loop of fighting monsters in like 5 different dungeons was quite boring, and even though it is on this list and I somewhat had a good time with it, I don't think I would recommend this game. Coming to the PlayStation 5, the first game I played for me was a double-edged sword, even before it came out, because the trailers and stuff looked amazing with crazy looking bosses and a world that seemed like a Soviet Bioshock. But I remember the developer behind the game behaving a little shady and giving some weird statements to the media. Luckily, in the end everything went well and the game released anyway. And it indeed looked really good and had some incredible creative ideas not only in the boss fights. But I remember experiencing some crashes and some very frustrating and clunky combat sections that felt much worse than the 17 years old original Bioshock. But all in all, I had more than enough fun with this game, and I'm glad that there are still new creative developers out there, and I hope we will see another game from them in the future. The next title on this list surprised me a lot, because it pretty much flew under my radar until its release. All I knew about Dead Island 2 was that it had a long and rough development history and its future didn't seem so promising. But when it came out, we got an amazing open world zombie sandbox with a huge variety of weapons to beat up the hordes of undead roaming the streets, and the stunning looking next gen visuals are accompanied by a big portion of spicy dark humor. So before I knew it, I finished everything the game had to offer and got myself the Platinum Trophy. Next up we have a game that I was looking forward to, but got disappointed by to some extent, and that is Star Wars Jedi Survivor. A few years after the first entry, you again play as Cal Kestis, and the story that is nothing too special but engaging with a few interesting twists, and the gameplay again felt great and responsive, but sadly all of this got overshadowed by a lot of technical difficulties by the time it released. I faced several crashes and performance issues, sometimes the textures wouldn't load, or I remember on some planet the water textures looked like a GIF from the early 2000s. And even though all of this might be patched by now, all in all it still damaged my experience to some extent. Fortunately, there still are developers out there that deliver quality games at release. One of these is Insomniac Games, and this year I played 2 titles developed by the Americans. The first one being Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, which according to Wikipedia is already the 16th entry in the series. The gameplay is a mix of third-person shooter and platformer, with the outstanding new feature being the rift that you can use to teleport around a map or even to completely new worlds. And like I said, everything in this game just feels polished and high quality. Exactly like Spider-Man 2, the other one of Insomniac's AAA games I finished this year. With an incredible looking open world, a flowing combat system that almost feels overwhelming when you first play it, an engaging story plot around the two Spider-Man and their opponents. As a Marvel fan, this game was a no-brainer for me, and it didn't disappoint. Definitely not disappointing as well for me was Valkyrie Elysium, a hack-and-slash action-adventure in a Norse mythology setting with a somewhat cel-shading look. The game is structured into several missions in separated areas, and if I had to compare it to something, I would say it feels like Drakengard 3 with a worse story but much better technical conditions. And while I had a good time with it, I haven't played this game over continuous days, but with bigger breaks in between sessions. And I think that this game is not one that would feel fresh enough if it were like 40 hours instead of the 15 to 20 it takes. A game that keeps you engaged way better is the 16th mainline entry to the Final Fantasy franchise. You play as Clive Rosfield, who gets betrayed by his own mother and fights with the power of the icons to avenge his family. The gameplay is even more action focused than in the last entry and feels more like an action adventure than an RPG. The graphics are among the best we have at the moment, and the story that goes more in the dark fantasy direction has everything I could wish for in a Final Fantasy game. My words might already have been obvious enough, but I was really looking forward to this game. And while a lot of people don't like the direction of the new Final Fantasy games, I love this game, and I'm looking forward to the future of the franchise. Right after 16, I wanted more of the franchise, and decided to finally play the first part of the Final Fantasy VII Remake. And when you compare the two, it really is impressive how different two games of the same franchise can be. Unlike in 16, where you have a medieval dark fantasy story, in Final Fantasy VII the narrative goes much more in a dystopian direction. You play as Cloud, an ex-soldier who is hired by a group of rebels that fight against a company that is harvesting the planet's energy for profit. The gameplay is more action-focused, unlike the turn-based approach of the original, and the graphics are still absolutely beautiful, although it was developed for the last gen. But at the end of the day, there's still a lot of story missing, and to really judge the remake in its entirety, we still have to wait for a few years. But what we have already seen lets us predict a bright future for the games. Leaving the genre but keeping the dystopian setting, we come to the game that inspired me to start this channel. Anno Mutationum is a fast-paced 2D action platformer that, besides some frustrating riddles, plays great from start to finish, and throughout the entire experience presents you with something new and fresh, especially with the outstanding creative boss fights. Rounded off by the beautiful 2D retro-style sceneries, you get a game that got me engaged so much that I went back to find everything this game had to offer and get myself the Platinum Trophy. For the most recent game on this list, I again have to mention the Persona franchise. Persona 5 Tactica is the next spin-off to the newest entry in the series that gameplay-wise takes a tactical approach. While it really felt great coming back to the Phantom Thieves, the game had some flaws, like the repetitive enemy types, the lack of depth to some characters, or the chibi art style that failed to deliver emotions in some situations. But even though this sounds really negative, my time with it was still above average, and it managed to arouse my interest in tactical RPGs. So if you watched until now and have recommendations, I would really love to read them in the comments. And last but not least, we have the game that everyone talks about since its release, the game of the year, Baldur's Gate 3. A turn-based RPG based on Dungeons and Dragons, where you can either create your own character or play as one of the companions you meet throughout the game. And oh boy, this game is impressive. It is literally the definition of freedom. If you can think of a solution to something, it is possible like 99% of the time. And the amount of content that you can find and will probably miss is ridiculous. Like after 120 hours of my playthrough, I still saw an endless amount of clips of stuff that I missed. This and the amount of classes and how the world reacts to them and the amount of possibilities that come with that gives this game even more replay value. And the combat that gives you so many opportunities, like for example instead of attacking with magic or any sort of melee weapon, if you're strong enough, just throw one of your opponents, or maybe they stand on a wooden framework, and instead of going up there and fight them, just make the structure collapse. Or my favorite thing, use Shadowheart, miss your third 99% chance Ignis in a row, and thundercount the neighbor's dog into oblivion. But jokes aside, there's nothing I can say that hasn't been said already, so just listen to the people and play it. It's amazing. If you have watched this video until now, thank you for that. Maybe consider subscribing and liking the video, and make sure to leave your favorite games you played in 2023 in the comments,